In our Eye on Emerging Markets, we are taking a look at Russia and the challenges of doing business there. Today's focus is Lukoil. This is the nation's second largest oil company. Its stock is up more than 8% over the past year, outperforming its larger competitor, Rosneft. Well, Andrei Gaidamaka, Deputy Vice President and Director of Strategic Planning for Lukoil, joins us now on the phone. He is live, coming to us from Moscow. He was also, by the way, an oil and gas analyst at Morgan Stanley. Dean Witter. He was a top-ranked Russian and East European analyst by the Institutional Investor. Very prestigious title there. Thanks so much, Andrei, for joining us. I know that it's probably a busy time over there, and you were telling me it's -5 degrees, which is pretty normal for you in Moscow. Let's talk a little bit about Lukoil and what you see looking ahead. I mean, 56% of Lukoil's revenue comes from regions actually outside of Russia. Do you see that growing as a percentage in the coming year?
Yes, we do see it continue to increase, even though I have to say that in terms of profit numbers, most of the profit is still coming from Russia, but we are rapidly increasing our presence in international upstream. That is becoming more and more significant contributor to our bottom line as well.
Now, I know your company is part of the national consortium, and you're considering investing $20 billion in a Venezuelan oil project. Tell me a little bit more about that and what other regions around the world that you're starting to develop bigger investments in.
Well, there are lots of negotiations around that very sizable investment that is being contemplated by the largest Russian oil companies that are compiled in the national consortium. But our biggest areas where we invest, not as part of the consortium, but on our own, are Middle Asia, such as Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. In the former Soviet Union, but also we are also actively involved in Iraq and in places like Egypt and North Africa. But also now we are more and more actively getting involved in exploration efforts in West Africa, in offshore Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, where we see very, very good prospects.
Andrei, what is your outlook for oil prices in 2011?
I believe that we're going to be in a fairly high level. I do believe that we're going to be at fairly similar level as we have today. So we are planning for actually a lower number for our own budget, but that's the company being fairly conservative. So I do think that sort of $80 to $95 a barrel is quite likely expectation.
Andrei, let's talk about some of the challenges for anyone that is looking at Russia, and there are a number of analysts and economists that are quite bullish on Russia as a regional play. But let's talk about some of the challenges facing any business there. I mean, there was a big economist spread out related to Khodorkovsky and his trial, and it talked a lot about corruption in the country. How is that impacting Lukoil, and how do you see that you're on the ground in Moscow? You were born there, raised there, and have lived around the world, many places. What is your perspective on the ground?
Well, actually, there are a few things that I think should be getting more coverage as far as Russia is concerned, and especially as far as oil and gas industry is concerned, and that is Russian oil and gas right now is going through lots of discussions about actually improvement of taxation system, because it has been fairly heavy taxation, which was not good enough for new greenfield investment. The government is recognizing that. So there is
Andrei,
a lot of
the taxation,
right
you're saying from a company perspective or from a personal perspective on individual taxpayers?
No, that's from the company perspective, of course.
All right,
and I'm talking about, the government is very interested to entice more investment into upstream properties, and so there is a lot of discussion about possibility of making the tax regime more flexible. Yet they want to compensate that with the higher tax regime on downstream, especially refining and marketing.
Now, since the global financial crisis, I mean, many analysts say that Russia was perhaps the most hard hit of industrialized nations, really got hit hard also now has become very reliant on the oil and gas industry. Is that your perspective as well? And do you see that changing in the coming years, not just next year? Will the government start to spend more on infrastructure projects that are outside of the gas and oil industry?
Well, the government is definitely focusing on diversifying the economy. Yet there is one thing that is really making those efforts more difficult, and that is the ruble is fairly high to international currencies. So that puts a lot of pressure on the manufacturing sector. And it puts actually less pressure on oil and gas, because oil and gas is the reason why ruble is so high. But it's due to very high cost base. Manufacturing sector is feeling more pressure.
You know, Andrei, a lot of people talk also about corruption as being a significant percentage of GDP in this country. Is that something that you speak freely about? Is that something that Lukoil, being the second largest in your field, that you have active talks with the government or amongst your executives?
Well, actually, interesting enough, with Lukoil being integrated, we have pretty good contact at all levels of the government. So I think that this is something that makes us less susceptible to any perceived problems on that side.
You know, Andrei, we don't, the media from this perspective, I'm based out of New York, you're absolutely right in saying, we're limited in what we cover coming out of Russia. What else are we missing?
Well, I think that the Russian oil and gas right now, especially, is the industry that continues to develop fairly dynamically, and there is a lot of focus on sort of negative sides on sort of Russian development, as you have discussed with the Khodorkovsky trial and so forth. But the fact of the matter is, companies like Lukoil are very actively investing in new plants and new technologies, and we are just finishing upgrade of our largest 400,000 barrels per day North Sea refinery. We're putting brand new cat cracker there, and we are starting with the upgrade of a few more refineries like Volgograd. This is very, very good margin business right now in Russia. I mean, refining, and that's where we're concentrating our efforts and our money. On the other hand, we are actively investing outside of Russia, using our sort of competitive advantage and knowledge of the geological basis in the third countries. And we already have over 10% of our production coming outside of Russia, and over, I believe, in terms of net income, we're already pushing about $1.5 billion coming out of, well, actually, in terms of EBITDA, coming outside of Russia. So I think that's something that is being missed somewhat, and that is, Russian companies are expanding in a place where they can really compete, and some of them are competing on a world scale.
Yep. And also, I know there's a lot going on with China, a lot of relations going on there. Unfortunately, Andrei, we have to leave it there. Have a good New Year. It was very nice having you joining us live from Moscow. Thanks very much, Andrei Gaidamaka of Lukoil.